Hi, and welcome to a very special episode of the Boxscore Geeks podcast. I am your host, and weirdly, because I'm typically the color man, so I get to be the host and the grown-up on this podcast since Andres isn't here, so it's Arturo and I've got Eitan Rosenberg, who is the Director of Analytics for the Fort Wayne Mad Ants, and he kindly consented to, which is an NBA DLT Development League team, and he kindly consented to join us on the podcast and talk a little bit about hoops while the season isn't quite over. So, Eden, introduce yourself.
Yeah.
So, I think
really happy to be here. Huge fan of the blog and obviously all the sort of the Boxscore Geeks podcast in the past. So really a pleasure for me being here.
It's great. Nice to have you. So I think we're going to get right into it. So because the finals are going on, we're going, instead of sagging, we're going to SIG, and we're going to start talking a little bit about what it's like working as an analytics person in basketball. So what's your experience been like? We were talking a little bit about this before the podcast. So we've all had this, or at least the kind of guys who listening to the podcast have had like this experience where you're trying to explain something that seems so obvious from the data to you to somebody who really has no background. And you're saying, but it's the rebounds. And the person's saying, no, it's the leadership. It's the leadership that actually matters. And kind of we were talking about a specific case, so a guy we called the king of analytics, and he's actually maybe a king in North Korea, Mr. Dennis Rodman.
Right. And then Dennis Rodman exemplifies it beautifully. I mean, and a lot of times he's the guy I bring up whenever I have this argument with owners, GMs, particularly actually Jeffrey Potter. I'm happy to say his name. He's the owner of GM of the Fort Wayne Mad Ants, and I'm not going to say the exact player, but there was an interesting story that I just thought of where there was a player that he loved. And he was an athletic freak. And he saw the player and he scouted him hard. And I recommended him actually not to draft this player. I saw other guys that I felt were just far more efficient. And he was a believer in advanced stats, which was great. I mean, and he understood sort of the value of it. He understands sort of how it translates to wins. But what happens is, whenever you deal with someone, right, in this industry that actually sees the talent. I'm not privy to obviously doing all those scouting trips. Your eyes, I feel, could fool you, and this is an argument Jeffrey and I will continue to have to this day. He probably wins the argument because Fort Wayne won the title, and a large part was due to this player. Again, I can't mention the name, but I feel like if someone did enough research, they could probably figure it out. And his eyes, I felt like your eyes can deceive you, right? And when you're looking at numbers in general, this is the point I always try to hammer home. There's things that could sort of stick out like a sore thumb that you wouldn't have noticed just with your eyes, because your eyes again can deceive you. It's that notion that I feel Jim doesn't get.
We call these guys I call them the five tool guys with 0 tool brains. And it's an ongoing point of contention. I think friend of the blog and friend of which is weird to say, but Malcolm Gladwell has the whole 10,000 hour thing, and where it applies to this is you have these guys who are extremely talented, but once they get set into these bad habits, once you've got set into these bad habits, and once you've gotten compensated and paid the max for those bad habits, it's really hard to break you. And it's the argument we have with Melo, which is, he has all the tool and all the ability. He can make all these shots that look really tough, but he's doing things that are low percentage, and at the end of the day are going to hurt you. And he's already gotten compensated for it, so it's really hard for him to get in a mode where he thinks it's bad. And it's an ongoing argument that we have about Russell Westbrook, where I say, look, Russell Westbrook is one of the most talented, or maybe the physically most gifted player in the league. But he's in the worst possible system for his talent because, one, they're making him play out of position. He's really a shooting guard playing point guard, and he's got a coach that basically just tells him to roll out the ball, right? So, I still think he's salvageable. I mean, this doesn't mean he's a bad player. I think he has the talent to be like the best player in the league, but he has to have the proper coaching and has to have the right guys around him. And this is kind of an ongoing story in the history of the NBA because I can mention one guy who comes to mind to me, and it's going to date me a little bit, is Derek Coleman. Derek Coleman was a supremely talented player, but he was a nutcase. He was a head case. He never kind of figured it out. And And you look at guys who kind of like turned it around. Like you can think about, let's talk about a guy from the finals. Let's talk about Boris Diaw. Boris Diaw is like, it's a huge thing and a huge guy for that Spurs system because he's a big who can shoot, he can pass, he can do all these things. But dude, he was like the main guy on like one of the worst teams in the history of the league. But again, it's about situation, it's about coaching, and you can have all the talent in the world, but if you never learn to actually apply it, then it becomes a real problem. And again, once you learn those habits, it's really hard for a player to break them. And hey, we're back. We're sorry we're having a little bit of technical difficulties on this very special episode of the Boxscore Geeks podcast. Before we got started, I wanted to kind of throw a shout out to we put up a T-shirt store, and Brian, who's our producer, liked one of the shirts that came up. We'll throw a link on the podcast to it. And hopefully like we can get back to the topics. We were talking about Boris Diaw and or at least I was talking about Boris Diaw and how he was able to go from like the worst situation ever probably to probably the best situation ever he could have gone to, and I think it's and become a really productive player because he was able to change his habits and become someone who kind of maximizes his skills, and he does have a lot of skills.
Yeah. And so I think that's more, and look, I wouldn't disagree, on how Diaz changed his game. But to be honest, that's also more of the Spurs testament, right? I mean, you look at Patty Mills, who was, lower end of the bench of Portland. You look at Danny Green, who got cut by Cleveland, right? So, San Antonio picks up these guys, knows that they could fit in a certain situation extremely well, understands when they kind of put these puzzles together, how well that all could look. And everything's sort of sublime. I think this might go off on a crazy tangent here. I think what's hilarious about the whole thing is, I think there's certain players that if they weren't on the Spurs, right, they would not be as good, and it's just because of the way they're able to attract all this sort of, almost Oakland A's style, right, like this sort of unique random talent and mix it together and it works really well just because it puts everyone in the right situation. I think it was hilarious when Brian Colangelo came out today and he said, I guess trying to give himself some better PR. Toronto was looking at drafting Kawhi Leonard apparently in the fifth pick, in the 2020 hindsight draft, right? So, I think what's especially hilarious about that is, who knows how good Leonard would be in a different situation, So I think when you point out about situations huge, those guys understand it. But to address the Melo from earlier.
Yeah, I always love the line from Colangelo that I love, and I think I put it in one piece where he said, like, no, he was really into analytics. He spent $100,000 a year on it when he was in Toronto.
Right. And, like, and the notion, like, I mean, look, I have stories, with Toronto and stuff, and I can tell you firsthand, he's not an analytics guy, right? I mean, just because you have people that are working on it, and we can give the data. It's about reading that data accurately, which I think circles back nicely here, but. And that's sort of the situation where a lot of guys, a lot of old school scouts who kind of rose the ranks and former players who became GMs, owners, coaches, what have you, that analytics guys talk to, and sort of set in the ways have had prior data people potentially talking to them, giving them information, but it's so important framing it up in a way that kind of makes sense to them, and that's really the key difference. And I'll be honest with you. I think there's a lot of things. I mean, I'm a super sort of blogger reader, right? And I've read you guys for a while. I've looked at all the sort of I've read all the books, obviously, and everything. And I've talked.
Oh no! Oh no! So I was going to make a point on this, which is that one of the key moments for me at Sloan was actually listening to Phil Jackson talk and describe how much data Tex Winter was actually capturing it. And Tex Winter apparently was a really hardcore analytics guy, and this was something that was really a big difference maker for the Bulls, particularly since they were back in the days when people had like Tandy computers in their houses. They had like video capture, and this is like back in the 90s when the Bulls were like they had video capture and direct lines going from the stadium to the practice facility to be able to like prep video presentations at halftime to show tendencies and show what was actually going on. So I mean it's the I mean like I was just eating, I was saying that like Phil is a guy who really valued this, and it was something that was really valuable when it was talked to him by Tex, and I mean it kind of shows. And I think what I was going to say is the point I was actually wanting to get to is it's about culture. So once you figure out what your culture is and what you value, right, then you want to recruit players and train your players to match that culture. Now, there isn't just one path to winning. There are multiple paths, but what you want to do is pick one and get the right players that go down that path.
Right, right. I mean, and that's a great point. I think, like, that's the right way to look at it. But a lot of guys, again, they go back to sort of, what they've seen, and I think the media plays a big part in it, right? But to kind of circle all the way back to a Melo thing, I think you have two certain types of players. You have guys who are situational players. Boris I think if there was it's great that you brought him up because I think if they made a basketball movie, on Moneyball I think Boris Diaw would be your Chad Bradford, right? He's a guy who looks a little overweight, right? Doesn't, at a surface level have any incredible athletic ability, and your average fan is gonna believe probably they could probably beat him on a one-on-one, right? And I think he's again, he got caught by Charlotte and everything. So I think he could be the sort of the new age Dennis Rodman, if you will,
Well, I mean, I
in all
think
of this, which I think is very interesting.
what it comes down to is there are things like he doesn't look right, but if you look at the things that you need a forward to do, right? He does everything we need a modern. He can shoot, he can post up, he can dribble, he can handle the ball, he can pass. He used to be a point guard. He can play defense. He's D'd up LeBron in situations. I mean, he doesn't do it all the time, but he will in spot duty do that. He spreads the floor out. He does everything you need a modern power forward to do. And this is like for the, I mean, like, it can't be understated. Having that guy on your bench, right? If you're the Spurs, is a huge luxury, and it gives them just kind of another dimension. And again, he doesn't look quite right, but I mean, there's a great line from I'm going to get a little scientifically and engineering wise, the Laplace transform. Laplace was a great engineer. He was a little bit crazy, and he did this transform, which is used in a bunch of mathematical calculations. And somebody famously once asked him, is like, well, how does it actually work? And Laplace looked at him and said, like, well, do you know how that sandwich was made? And the guy says, no, I don't know how the sandwich was made. Well, it still tastes good, so you don't need to know how it was made, right? So
Right.
the point being that, it doesn't matter how you look, right? It matters that it tastes good, right? So, and that's kind of where people kind of get crossed up because they confused, what your eye tell you, the eye test versus results. And sometimes I think the job of the analytics guy is to be able to say to the team, look, here's, if you tweak lever A, you're going to get results, right? So if you move this in this direction, you should be able to see measurable results on the court, right? So, and that's kind of the challenge. And how do you get it down to a simple level? I always got taught it's practical, graphical, analytical, right? So it should make practical sense. You should be able to explain it, right? You should be able to show it graphically, and you should be able to show it analytically. They should have the results, right? So if I did something, you should be able to prove like either you make more money or you win more games. And I think that's kind of where we have to do that. And as I said, there isn't one right answer, but whatever your answer is, you should be consistent with it. And I think that's where kind of like the teams that are successful now, if you look at it, you got San Antonio plays a certain style, Miami plays a certain style, Indiana plays a certain style, Oklahoma plays a certain style, right? And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think along with that, like, yeah, it's not only the eye test; it's also history, right? So, a lot of guys, I'll give you an example, like shorter point guards in the draft, right? So you see guys like Isaiah Thomas, fallen, Jimmy Nelson, fell out of the lotto, Ty Lawson fell a bit, right? And they perform well in the NBA, right? Nate Robinson, obviously, right? So, shorter point guards always fall, and they always typically do better than the draft
Hmm. Well,
stock if you look in history. So one of the interesting things about that is, sure, go ahead.
no, I was
So
gonna
say
say
like,
basically one of my and you're getting into one of my beliefs, which is I think that I'm a little bit like football in that I don't believe in spending a lot of draft money on point guards, but that's just me. I think you want to spend your draft money or your draft credit or your draft stock on like big men because those are rare and generally like lead much more winning. Point guards are available generally, and particularly if you look at the NBA, there's only really one point guard that's like valuable, and really that's Chris Paul. Everybody else is kind of on a separate tier, and it's like kind of like spending a high draft pick on a running back in the NFL, right? I'm not, but that's just me. I mean, and your point is valid though.
Well, no, and I wouldn't disagree there. What I think is, I think the later you go in the draft, right, you could, and if you need a point guard, that's a good place to steal a point guard, right? Like you constantly see point guards sort of quote unquote falling in the draft. You know, Rajon Rondo is a great example. I remember in that draft, Brian Colangelo, again, bringing him up again, you know, thought that there was a documentary on the Raptors TV, right? He thought he could, you know, he was shocked when the Celtics, who ended up trading the pick, right, didn't draft a point guard. I think they had the 7th or 8th pick. He thought they're going to take. He thought that, you know, they were desperate for a point guard. They're going to take Marcus Williams. You know, Danny Ainge ends up buying a pick and getting Rajon Rondo at 20.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the history, if you think about it, the history, if I want to think about like lottery picks, point guard lottery picks that like make the finals or win the titles, I think I come up with. I was like, I come up with like Jason Kidd and Magic Johnson, like off the top of my head, but I don't come up with a lot of guys who are like point guards who are lottery picks who kind of win titles or go to the finals.
Yeah, no, I
Iverson. I always forget Iverson.